Hello YouTube. We're continuing our look at the paradox of fiction, which results from these three individually plausible premises. I won't go through it again, so go and watch the first video if you haven't yet. So today we'll begin by looking at the counterpart theory. Now, like Radford and Walton, counterpart theorists reject premise 2. They reject that we have rational emotional responses to fictional characters. The counterpart theorist says we do have rational emotional responses when we engage with fictions. These responses are not directed at fictional characters, but rather at real-world counterparts of those characters. When we engage with fictions, this provokes in us thoughts of real people, or it leads us to reflect on the real world in certain ways, and this is what makes our emotional response rational. And I think there are, a couple of cases where this is obviously plausible. So consider sexual arousal. Suppose you're sexually attracted to a character. For the men, here's Eva Green from Casino Royale. She plays Vesper Lynd, the Bond girl. Now, I'm not sure who the sex symbols for women are, so this is Rick Mayall from Bottom. He plays a character called Richie. Many women will look at Richie and find his appearance and behaviour very sexually arousing. Now, it's plausible in this case to say that you're not really aroused by Richie, you're aroused by Rick Mayall. It's not the fictional character that arouses you, but the appearance and the actions of the man playing him. You don't find Richie sexy, you find Rick Mayall playing Richie sexy. That seems reasonably plausible to me. It's not so obvious how to extend this to other emotions. I assume you hate Joffrey, but presumably you don't hate the actor playing Joffrey. You don't hate Jack Gleeson playing Joffrey. In fact, you might really like Jack Gleeson. I don't know him at all, but maybe he's a really nice guy. So there are a couple of ways to develop this theory. Barry Paskins suggests that when you hate Joffrey, your hatred is for real people who behave in similar ways as Joffrey. Real people who have similar character traits. Similarly, if you feel sad for Sansa, your sadness is for the real people who've had similar troubles as Sansa. Of course, this kind of approach runs into the immediate problem that with some fictional characters, we might not really know of any real person who's in a sufficiently similar situation. Joffrey and Sansa live in a medieval fantasy world. Can we really say that they have any real-world counterparts? So William Charlton has a slightly different way of putting this theory. He gives what he calls a hypothetical analysis. So in Homer's poem The Odyssey, we want Odysseus to leave. Or supposedly we do. I've never actually read The Odyssey. I don't know. But we want Odysseus to leave. And this amounts, according to Charlton, to having the hypothetical wish that if a friend were in Odysseus's position, we should act to get him to leave. Similarly, saying something like, I feel for Anna Karenina, means if any of my friends had a husband like Karenina or a lover like Vronsky, would that I might be able to help her do what is best. I actually don't know what the story of Anna Karenina is, but presumably the hypothetical analysis would work for Sansa in this kind of way. I feel sad for Sansa means if any of my friends were betrothed to Joffrey, would that I might be able to help them get the hell out of there. Simple enough idea there, I think. I don't find either of these suggestions very plausible. There are three main problems. So, first of all, we have these kinds of responses even in cases where we don't feel for the fictional characters. So here's a story. Cecil is an evil rich man who moves into town and steals from the poor. He had his henchmen break into Taylor's house and take all of Taylor's money. Taylor's children are starving. The end. Now, in this case, we know perfectly well that there are many people in similar positions as Cecil and Taylor. Similarly, we can well imagine what we might want our friends to do if they were in either Cecil or Taylor's position. But we feel nothing for Cecil or Taylor. So our emotional responses to fictional characters can't just come down to our feelings for real people, or our feelings about what we'd want our friends to do if they were in the position of the fictional characters. There must be more involved in that. So this theory, even if it's hinting at something right, it doesn't seem to be complete, because otherwise we should feel just as much for Cecil and Taylor as we do for Joffrey and Sansa. So second, what about when we root for the villains and dislike the good guys? We saw that Kendall Walton's theory can deal with this very well, but Counterpart Theory has some difficulties. As I mentioned last time, I don't like Sansa. I want her to die. I really like Peter Baelish. Now, the Counterpart theorist says that this comes down to hating real people who are in a similar position to Sansa, or liking real people similar to Peter Baelish, which makes me turn out to be kind of an arsehole. But of course I'm not an arsehole, I'm a perfectly nice guy, and obviously the real people in Sansa's position have my pity. So we can't say that our reactions to fictional characters are really reactions to real-world counterparts. You know, it's okay to root for villains and root against the good guys precisely because they're fictional. You know, that's what makes the difference here. Third, there's the problem that our reactions to fictional characters and real people differ, and these differences of our reactions are related to differences of the objects. They're related to the difference between fiction and reality. I guess this is actually quite similar to the last point, but I'm going to put it a different way here. So maybe the best way to see this is to consider watching people die. Suppose on the one hand you watch a fictional film involving people getting tortured to death, like Saw. You know, they have horrible, terrible deaths. You know, it's just awful. Blood everywhere, gore, pain, torture, you know, really terrible, terrible deaths. A fictional film. On the other hand, consider a film of a real death. Maybe it's not even a very bad death. Maybe it's like an old man who just is like wandering along, has a sudden heart attack and drops dead. Now, many people would find the real death more disturbing than the fictional death. Even though the fictional deaths are far more brutal and painful. It's the same with, you know, when you read a fictional account of a fictional serial killer versus the real descriptions of real-world serial killers. Don't you find the latter more unsettling? And this kind of thing happens with many emotions. When you envy a real person, isn't that just like more powerful, more frustrating than the envy you have for fictional people? You know, in general, there would be something quite odd about a person who responded to fictional characters in just the same way as they respond to real people. You know, there's clearly a difference. But if the counterpart theorist is right, and our response to fictional characters just is a response to their real counterparts, how do we capture this difference? You know, in all cases, we're reacting to real people. Finally, and maybe most importantly, it's just sort of obvious that we don't feel for real-world counterparts when we engage with fictions. We simply feel for the fictional characters. You know, yes, there are cases like sexual arousal where it's plausible to say that we're really aroused by Evergreen, the actress, rather than Vesper Lynd, the Bond girl. But to say of Joffrey that, you know, really we hate people like Joffrey, I think this is just clearly falsified by our own experience. I mean, I for one know that I hate Joffrey. I'm not even thinking of other people when I hate Joffrey. When we're watching a fiction that emotionally moves us, we get caught up in the story. We're less able to consider real counterparts. When I'm watching Game of Thrones, I get worked up. I hate Joffrey. I want this guy to die. I'm not thinking of the real world. On the other hand, if I'm watching a really boring TV show, I don't really care about any of the characters. In that case, you know, my mind will wander, and I might end up thinking of real people. But certainly when I'm watching Game of Thrones, I don't think I am. So I don't find that those versions of the counterpart theory very plausible. Although a somewhat different version of the counterpart theory is suggested by Michael Weston. Now, to be honest, I find Weston's theory quite obscure. His paper's not that easy to read. But I think the basic idea is that what we respond to when we respond to fictional characters, what we respond to fictions, are not the fictional characters in themselves, but rather abstract ideas, or at least how the story of the fictional characters expresses abstract ideas. So Weston suggests that we're moved by things like the thought that even the most intimate and intense relationships must end, or the thought of the terrible things that men do to each other. What we have to bear in mind, according to Weston, is that fictional characters always exist as parts of wider works of art. So, It's not just that we have a character called Joffrey and a character called Sansa. Rather, Joffrey and Sansa are part of a much bigger work of art called Game of Thrones, or for those of you who are into the books, A Song of Ice and Fire. Who the hell has time to read a whole book these days? Anyway, I think part of Weston's point is that when we respond to Joffrey, when we hate Joffrey, we can't really separate those responses from our response to Game of Thrones as a whole, to the ideas and themes that it develops. So Weston suggests that there's an important difference between our emotional responses to real life and our emotional responses to fiction. We don't treat real life as having a particular story, a particular direction. We don't suppose that events in real life are part of some wider structure through which it's trying to express various meanings or themes. So this means that if I hear, for instance, that your son has died, I don't have to have any reasons for feeling sad, or at least I don't have to have any reasons that relate the death of your son to some sort of broader narrative. It's enough to say, you're my friend and your son has died. That's enough to provoke sadness. But we always have reasons for feeling for fictional characters. We have reasons that place our feeling for the fictional character in the context of the whole artwork. Reasons that relate the fate of the character to the artwork as a whole. So Weston says, the provision of such reasons is a description of the object of the observer's emotion. To be moved by Mercutio's death is to respond in the light of one's interpretation of that episode in the context of the play, and hence is part of one's response to the sense we see in the play as a whole. We need to know the themes of the play, what the play is about, and so on. We relate the particular events to these grander themes. Our response to the death is a response to the whole structure of the play, and also to the conception of life expressed by the play, to the particular point or theme of the play. Real life, on the other hand, doesn't involve interpretation, it doesn't express themes. We don't relate the events that happen to particular individuals to the meaning or structure of real life as a whole. In real life, things just happen. Now, notice that one of the benefits of Weston's view is that it isn't vulnerable to the problem of my story about Cecil and Taylor. We don't respond emotionally to Cecil or Taylor, and Weston can give quite a nice account of why. It's because the wider artwork in which the characters of Cecil and Taylor appear just totally sucks. It's rubbish. It's a very short story, there's no attempt to set the scene in any way, there's no character development, there's barely any plot, there's not even any interesting or poetic language. It's totally simplistic and dry, doesn't even attempt to develop any weighty themes. So, of course, Cecil doesn't anger us. Of course, we're not moved by Taylor's plight. The fictional work of which they're part is just too poorly developed. And I also guess Weston gives quite a nice account of why we kind of respond to fictions in different ways as we respond to real life. As we saw, that was a problem with the first kind of counterpart theory, which is that our responses to fiction in real life can differ. Weston obviously gives a very good account of why that might be. However, there are some problems with Weston's theory. First of all, I think he's just wrong that responses to real life and fiction differ in the way that he suggests. I mean, they do differ, don't get me wrong. Obviously, we respond to fiction in real life very differently, but I don't think they differ in the particular way that Weston suggests. So, of course, I have to know Mercutio's role in the play and the wider context and the narrative as a whole and so on to have an emotional response to his death. But similarly, I have to know you to feel sad about your loss. I mean, we don't weep for the thousands of people dying every day. Every day, thousands of people lose their children, they lose their parents, lots of very sad things going on. We don't care. I mean, we can't care. It's just a general fact that we have to have some sort of context and detail in order to have an emotional response. Okay, second, Weston's view is just too intellectual. In many cases, we just don't care about the themes, the abstract ideas, but we're still powerfully moved. Think of people being moved by, sappy romance films or something. They're probably not reflecting on the messages expressed by the work or on its thematic structure or whatever. I mean, all of us at some point or another engage with fiction just on autopilot, as it were. Even with cases like Shakespeare, our reason for feeling sad about Mercutio's death could just be, well, I liked the character, I didn't like how he died. We might not be very reflective about the play. Also, even when we are being reflective, Western's view only seems to account for the powerful emotions. But what about the minor emotions that we feel? Slightly funny scenes, slightly annoying character traits, and so on. It's not so clear how any of these are reactions to the wider themes of the fiction. It also surely doesn't work for fear. Being scared, being afraid. If anything, that shuts down the more intellectual, reflective processes. Finally, I think the most pressing difficulty here is that there's just a very obvious and very big difference between our response to a fiction as a whole and our response to the characters in the fiction. I have particular reactions to the narrative construction of Game of Thrones. I can reflect on the themes it expresses, I can consider its complexity, how pleasingly it intertwines many different stories, all this sort of thing. I mean, that's one thing, but detesting Joffrey and pitying Sansa is something else entirely. So, I think Weston is obviously hinting at something right. He's right that our emotional response to Joffrey can't be totally divorced from our reaction to Game of Thrones as a whole. But the connection he's trying to draw between the two reactions is too tight. What it really comes down to, I think, is just that you're obviously going to feel more strongly about someone the more you know about them. That's why our hatred of Joffrey is inextricably linked to our reaction to Game of Thrones as a whole. You only learn about Joffrey by engaging with Game of Thrones, or with the book. And so it is for any other artwork. The artwork is just, the best way of learning about the characters contained within it. So, maybe that doesn't work, that theory. Right, moving on. The thought theory, which was first suggested by Peter Lamarck, rejects premise 1. According to the thought theorist, we can have a rational emotional response to something even if we don't believe it exists. We can have an emotional response to something simply by imaginatively entertaining the idea, simply by mentally representing it in our minds. We don't have to believe it's true, we just have to have the thought. Lamarck puts it this way: the fear and pity we feel for fictions are in fact directed at thoughts in our minds. We don't need to believe that Joffrey is a dickhead to hate Joffrey. It's enough for us merely to have the thought that Joffrey is a dickhead. We just entertain that thought in our minds, and we have an emotional response to that. I mean, obviously, reality is a bit more complex than that. You don't simply think Joffrey is a dickhead. If that was all, you wouldn't feel anything towards that. You remember the story about Cecil and Taylor. The fiction needs to provide context and detail, so really you have a whole cluster of various different thoughts about Joffrey, all prompted by Game of Thrones. I mean, and it does seem to be true that just bringing a thought to our minds can affect us. Lamarck suggests, suppose you're standing on the edge of a dangerous precipice. Merely thinking about falling off, even if there's no danger, can disturb you, makes you very uncomfortable. A better example that I like is bad things happening to genitals. Imagine you're about to have sex with a woman. You're about to do it on a table or something, but unbeknownst to you there's a nail sticking out of the side of the table, and as you thrust forward to insert your penis, you catch it on the nail and rip it lengthways, and the muscly bit inside pops out of the skin like a hot dog. A lot of people find that thought quite disturbing. Another one is if you have a knife and you point the knife at your own eye, and then just think about stabbing yourself in the eye. You know you're not going to do it, but just thinking about it makes you uncomfortable. You get the idea. That's probably enough. There's probably enough examples there. So in the same way, we just imaginatively entertain things. We just have the thought, how we just have thoughts about Joffrey, and that's enough. We respond to them. An immediate objection here is to attack the analogy that we just saw. The examples that I gave all concern things that make us uncomfortable. They all concern unpleasant things happening to our bodies, and they produce a very brute reaction, a sort of, oh God, no thank you, that kind of thing. So the question is it plausible to extend this account to more complex emotions? Emotions like anger and pity and wistfulness. Can you make yourself wistful by just bringing a thought to your mind? Also note that many of our emotional reactions to fictions happen too quickly for us to form clear thoughts, like when a monster suddenly pops up which makes us jump, or perhaps if a character is suddenly threatened by something terrible. We just react immediately and unreflectively. Now, what the thought theorist would draw attention to here is the detail and the vividness of fiction. Fiction, by showing us the events, by actually showing us the events in films or in paintings, or describing them in great detail, it allows the entertainment of more complex thoughts, so it prompts a wider variety of emotions. If we just sit on our own and try to imagine things, we have to do a lot of work. Even with the case of the knife in the eye, you might have to put quite a lot of thought into that before you imagine it vividly enough to make you uncomfortable. But fiction does all the work for us. So that's, I think, a reasonable response to that objection. Perhaps a more serious objection isn't the thought theory just very unnatural? I mean, surely we don't feel sad about the thought of Boromir's death. We feel sad about Boromir's death. We don't envy the thought of Legolas's incredible archery skills. We envy Legolas's archery skills. I mean, in fact, what would be involved in envying the thought of Legolas's incredible archery skills? Why would you envy the thought of that? I mean, you have the thought, so what are you envying there? Surely you just envy his archery skills. Remember Carroll's complaint about Walton? He said that Walton throws out the phenomenology for the sake of logic. I think we could say the same for the thought theory, which is maybe kind of ironic because that's actually Carroll's own solution. Now let me make an important clarification here. There's no question that it's thoughts that provoke or cause your emotion. After all, Boromir doesn't really exist, so it could only be the thought of his death that causes your emotion, because he doesn't exist, he hasn't actually died, so his death can't cause anything, because it didn't happen. But the question here is whether your emotion is directed at the thoughts. The thought theorist doesn't merely claim that thoughts cause your emotion, the claim is that your emotion is directed at the thoughts. So maybe consider this example, this might help illustrate my point. You're watching the news when you see a story about a tsunami overseas. Thousands of people have been killed. Now in this case, it's the images and sounds on the television that have caused your emotion. Just in terms of physical causation, had you not have had the television on at that time, you wouldn't have had the emotion at that time. So it's the images and sounds of the television that are the proximate cause. But your emotion isn't directed at the images and sounds on the television. It's directed to the victims of the tsunami. You feel sad for the tsunami victims, not for the pixels on a TV screen. The images and sounds on the television are simply the means by which you've been made aware of the victims of the tsunami. So, similarly, when you read Lord of the Rings, obviously Boromir doesn't exist. Boromir never really died because he was never really alive in the first place. So, when you read about Boromir's death and feel sad, Boromir's death cannot be the cause of your sadness. That's obviously true. And maybe the thought theorist is right that what causes your sadness is merely the thought of Boromir's death. But the point is, our sadness isn't directed at the thought of Boromir's death. It's directed at Boromir's death. Plain and simple. The basic point here is that when we watch fictions, it's not that there's the fiction and then there's the thought and then we respond to the thought. We simply respond to the fiction. There isn't some further process there, like mediating between the fiction and the response, or at least no more than with real events. Well, that's how it certainly seems. In fact, there's a kind of deeper problem here, which is that the thought theory maybe depends on an untenable philosophy of mind. So let's consider the case of a real person. Suppose you envy Frank Zappa's guitar playing. So what I want you to do is just think about how good a guitarist Frank Zappa is. Or if you don't know Frank Zappa, just think of somebody whose abilities you really admire. You really envy them. Now I can easily think about Frank Zappa's skill at the guitar. I can think about him playing, can imagine him spending all that time practicing and so on. So I can consider Frank Zappa's guitar playing. Now the question is, what about my thought of Frank Zappa's guitar playing? What exactly am I considering when I consider my thought of Frank Zappa's guitar playing? The problem here is that it seems that the thought is, as it were, transparent. When I try to attend to my thought of Frank Zappa's guitar playing, I just see through the thought and I end up attending to Frank Zappa's guitar playing. And I think there's something in this point, because if you ask me to consider Frank Zappa's guitar playing, okay, I can do that. Now if you ask me to consider my thought of Frank Zappa's guitar playing, I don't really know what I'm considering in the latter case. In both cases I end up thinking about the same thing, namely Frank Zappa's guitar playing. So the very idea that we can attend to the thought of P, rather than this just being a matter of attending to pee, is very questionable. So this kind of supports the problem I raised earlier. We don't respond to the thoughts provoked by the fiction, we simply respond to the fiction. Beyond all of this though, the main problem with the thought theory, the really big problem, is that it's not clear how it's actually supposed to solve the paradox in any case. Surely we can just rephrase the paradox. How is it rational to be frightened by, to feel pity for, to be moved to ecstasy by mere thoughts? I mean, sure, maybe we can emotionally be moved by mere thoughts, but how is that not irrational? If I'm frightened by the mere thought of a monster in my cupboard, there's a clear case where we'd say that my fear is irrational. Or we'd be tempted to say that fear is irrational. I mean, it can be easy to miss this point. Perhaps I can feel sad about the thought that my parents are going to die, and why would this be irrational? But of course this depends on an existence belief, since I know that they will die. I know that this is going to happen, even if it hasn't happened yet. So maybe a better example would be, how can it be rational to be sad about the thought of my parents being captured by orcs and imprisoned in Sauron's torture chambers at Mordor? In fact, it's not so much that I'm saddened by the thought that my parents are going to die. What makes me sad is the fact that my parents are going to die. But there is no fact that they'll be captured by orcs and imprisoned at Mordor. So it seems to me that the thought theory really just kind of restates the paradox. It doesn't really solve it. So moving on. I'm not really sure what the name of this theory is, and it's not a theory that I've seen explored so often, but I'll call it nonrationality theory. The basic claim here is that emotions in general are not rational. Now, it's important to distinguish non-rationality from irrationality. Remember, Radford's claim is that our emotional responses to fictions are irrational, in contrast to our emotional responses to real things, which are rational, at least sometimes. They can at least sometimes be rational. Irrationality obtains when something aims at rationality but goes wrong. So a classic example of irrationality would be somebody offering an argument that's obviously logically invalid. All men are mortal, Socrates is a man, therefore Socrates is not mortal. That's clearly a case of irrationality. Or somebody who sticks to a belief obsessively, even if they admit that there's lots of good evidence against it. If there's lots of good evidence against your belief, you should change your belief, right? But obviously many things are non-rational. Is a mountain rational or irrational? Well, that's a silly question. Clearly only conscious beings can be rational or irrational. But even many things that conscious beings do might not be one or the other. So think about involuntary movements. Sometimes when you're drifting off to sleep and your leg suddenly jerks and wakes you up. That's called a hypnagogic jerk. Many people get them. So is a hypnagogic jerk rational or irrational? No. How about preferring chocolate ice cream to vanilla ice cream? Is it irrational to like chocolate ice cream more than vanilla ice cream? I mean, obviously these sorts of preferences can't be described in terms of rationality. So, according to non-rationality theory, the whole attempt to set up this kind of paradox just fails. Non-rationality theory rejects all of the premises. Premises 2 and 3 are simply false, and premise 1 rests on a false presupposition. The statement of the paradox of fiction rests on a category error because rationality simply doesn't apply to emotions. Emotions are non-rational. Rationality concerns beliefs, or it concerns the inferences between beliefs. It simply doesn't apply to emotions, to how we feel about things. The emotional or affective parts of our minds can't be described in the same way as the rational, intellectual parts. This kind of thing is one of the things that Hume was getting at, although in a somewhat different context, with the lovely quote, "'Tis not contrary to reason to prefer the destruction of the world to the scratching of my finger." Even even a feeling of joy at the total destruction of the whole world, even that isn't irrational. No emotion is irrational. Obviously, if emotions in general are non-rational, then there's no special paradox about our emotional responses to fictions. We just have emotional responses to fictions. That's that. That's just a kind of brute fact about the kind of beings we are. It's just something we do, like sleeping or breathing or enjoying the taste of chocolate ice cream. It's silly to try to evaluate it in terms of rationality. Now, a great benefit of non-rationality theory is that it allows for basically unlimited variety of emotional responses. And when we start to consider the wide variety of things that we actually have emotional responses to, it does seem that there are many cases where emotional responses don't require existence beliefs, but where we're not tempted to declare that there's any irrationality. So, for instance, we have emotional responses to past people who no longer exist, to future people who do not exist yet, but who might be harmed by global warming. We feel bad about that. We have emotional responses to abstractions, for instance, pity for the homeless as a whole. We have emotional responses to mere possibilities, such as the possibility of a tidal wave hitting my village. Emotional responses to pretense in contexts beyond fictional artworks, such as fear of a very realistic replica of a spider, even though we know it's merely a realistic replica. And finally, we feel emotions that aren't directed at any particular object at all, whether real or merely possible or fictional or whatever. When you listen to a song, the sound of the music can make you feel sad. It's not that your sadness is directed at the music. It's not that you feel sad for the music. It's just the particular sounds provoke a certain emotional state in you. Or consider waking up one day and just feeling very happy and jubilant for no particular reason. You're just in a very good mood. You're not happy because of such and such. You just feel happy. This kind of thing can happen with fictions. Films will often use music to provoke emotions in us. I'm sure you've heard the cliche that if you watch a horror film with the sound off, it's not scary anymore, because it's the music that is just provoking that response of fear. Or when we read books, the mere style of the writing is often an important part of why we feel sadness or pity for the characters. The structure of the sentences, the choice of words, can in itself be very evocative. It seems very difficult to see how these kinds of cases could be called rational or irrational. Obviously, some of the theories that we've previously looked at can capture some of these cases. For instance, thought theorists can explain why we might have an emotional response to a mere abstraction. But the point here is that when we actually consider the vast variety of emotions, we have emotions towards all kinds of things. It is tempting to say, humans have emotions. We have emotions towards everything and anything. It's just arbitrary to pick on fictions and say, oh, there's a problem here. The benefit of the non-rationality theory is that it allows us to treat emotions as this kind of brute fact about humans. It allows us to just dissolve the paradox in a very kind of neat way, because none of these are really rational or irrational. They just are. The things that, I think an important point here is that a lot of emotions as well are just kind of beyond our control. We don't really have any, they just kind of happen to us. So how can that be a matter of, rationality or irrationality? So it's a tempting theory. One of the main problems for this theory is that there are some emotional responses that do actually seem to be clearly irrational, and we've already looked at an example of this. So take two people who are watching Hamlet. The first feels sad for Ophelia, that's fine. The second feels sad, then angry, then jubilantly happy, then sad again, then jealous, and so on, all within the space of 5 minutes. Isn't this second person's response just irrational? Well, I think everybody would admit that there's an important distinction between these reactions, and our theory needs to account for it. But the non-rationality theorist would say that this distinction doesn't have to be described in terms of rationality. We can redescribe it, and in fact we can describe it in better and more enlightening terms. So for instance, we can say that some reactions are appropriate or inappropriate. If you're laughing at a funeral, that doesn't seem to be irrational necessarily, but it does seem to be inappropriate. We can say that some emotional reactions are inconsistent with others, or they kind of clash with others. So with this person who's having all these different feelings about Ophelia, he starts off sad, then suddenly becomes angry, then becomes very happy. We can ask him, what's changed? Why do you have these radically different emotions? And the problem, of course, is nothing has changed. Ophelia's character doesn't radically change several times in the space of 5 minutes. So the same thing that makes him sad then makes him happy, then makes him angry. These emotions clash. They're not consistent with each other. So we don't have to say that this man's emotions are irrational. His emotions are certainly very odd, but we can describe that oddness in other ways, and actually in kind of more enlightening ways. It's also worth noting that some paradigm cases of irrational emotions are really a matter of irrational beliefs or irrational inferences. So consider religious fundamentalists who get terrified by rock music because they think it's genuinely influenced by the devil, it's genuinely trying to get people to turn to Satan. We could say that their fear is irrational, but I think it's more natural to say that their beliefs, or their justification of their beliefs, is irrational. Their beliefs are not very well supported. Because, of course, if there really was this being called Satan, and if it really was the case that rock music was influencing people to sell their souls to Satan, then it actually would be entirely appropriate to be scared of rock music. So it's not the emotion that's irrational, it's the emotion is actually appropriate given the beliefs, but the beliefs are irrational. And I think that many cases of seemingly irrational emotions probably rest on irrational beliefs. Now, with all of this said, if you are still committed to the idea of irrational emotions, there's a weaker version of non-rationality theory that still gets the job done. We could say that once you have an emotional attachment to something, considerations of rationality enter. But whether or not to have an emotional attachment in the first place is not a matter of rationality. So, sure, it would be irrational if you see a friend, and even if he's just standing there, you feel happiness, then anger, then happiness, then terribly sad, then angry for no reason, that's irrational. But having some sort of emotional response isn't a matter of rationality. The act of having some kind of emotional commitment or emotional attachment, or just response to something, isn't a matter of rationality. Once you've had that response, we can maybe talk about whether things that follow from that are rational or not. So that's non-rationality theory. Right, last one. What I'm calling the existence theory isn't a theory that I've actually seen any philosopher explicitly expound, but it occurred to me that this might be a response you could make. So the existence theory agrees with Radford that our responses to fictions are irrational, incoherent, at least for most people. But it argues that they can be made rational and coherent. The existence theorist attacks premise 3, and he holds that, in fact, fictional characters do exist. Of course, most people don't believe that fictional characters exist, so their emotional reactions are irrational. But the existence theorist says we should believe they exist, and if we accept this belief, our reactions would be rational. According to David Lewis, every possible world really exists, in just the same sense that our actual world exists. Every way a world could be is a way that some world is. The name of this view is modal realism. Physicists have the multiverse theory. That might work here as well, but I'm going with modal realism because, I know philosophy and I'm not really so good with physics. So, to use one of Lewis's examples, it's logically possible that there are talking donkeys. Had evolution developed differently, there might have been talking donkeys. So there is a world, in fact there are infinitely many worlds, just as real as our world, at which there are talking donkeys. It's presumably logically possible, although it isn't physically possible, for something to go faster than light. It would violate the physical laws of this universe, but there's no logical contradiction in the idea of going faster than light. So, there's a world, there are infinitely many worlds, just as real as our world, at which things go faster than light. Every way things logically could have been is a way that some world is. Now, Lewis wasn't responding to the paradox of fiction. He had other reasons for proposing this theory, or he said he had other reasons. I'm never really sure what his reasons were, to be honest. But anyway, I think it's pretty clear how his view could apply here. The Lord of the Rings is fiction, but to say that something is fiction is merely to say that it's not true. In our world, The Lord of the Rings is in fact a totally accurate account of real events that took place in some other world. So it's no less rational to feel emotionally moved by Lord of the Rings than it is by documentaries that show us things taking place in other countries. Just because something's taking place in Africa doesn't mean it doesn't exist. Just because something's taking place in another possible world doesn't mean it doesn't exist. They both exist in just the same way. Africa's a bit closer to us, of course, but that's neither here nor there. Now, it's important to bear in mind with this theory that it obviously can't solve all of our responses, such as fear. How would it be rational to be afraid of something in a different world? okay, the green slime exists and it is indeed terrifying a small 1950s American town, but it doesn't exist in our world, so who cares? But maybe this could work for emotions like sadness, pity, envy, hope. We can feel sad when Boromir dies because there really is a real person called Boromir who really is in the circumstances depicted in Lord of the Rings. The main problem with this theory, of course, why should we believe that all possible worlds exist? I'm not going to go into that because it would just be a total tangent. If you're interested, you'll have to pick up David Lewis's book on the plurality of worlds. Spoilers, it's a ridiculous theory and there's no good reason whatsoever to believe it. I just thought it was worth mentioning. I just occurred to me that this might be a response that David Lewis could use. I don't think anybody else would want to use this response because it's just a stupid theory. So, moving on. We've looked at some ways of dealing with the paradox of fiction. None of them seem entirely satisfactory on their own. I'd just like to make a couple of final points. First, remember that Radford's conclusion, and this is a conclusion pretty much everyone rejects, is that our emotional reactions to fiction are irrational, incoherent, illogical. Is this conclusion really so bad? I'm not so sure. In fact, I think it's quite reasonable for some cases. Consider that when a film frightens us, we do, in fact, often say, "Don't be silly, it's only a movie." In cases like these, we seem to grant that we're being irrational. It's similar to phobias. Frank is terrified of spiders, though he knows there's nothing to be scared of. He knows that most spiders aren't going to hurt him. Frank's fear is irrational. Another point Radford raises, which is worth bearing in mind, is that there are many cases where our behaviour and emotions are irrational beyond fictions. He gives the examples. Suppose that Jim is watching a tennis match and the player that Jim is rooting for is losing. And as Jim sees the ball about to go in the net, he kind of jumps up. He makes a sort of movement as though he's trying to will the ball to go over the net. Or when you're watching a boxing match, you might make punching motions with your arms as though you can help your favourite player through the sheer force of your will. These sorts of behaviours seem to be irrational because we know that we're not going to be able to influence them through the sheer force of our will. Or consider the fear of death. Like many people, I think that when you die, that's it. It's over. There's nothing after death. I think consciousness is produced by the brain, so when the brain goes, you go. There's nothing. There is, quite literally, nothing to fear. But I still fear it. And pointing out that there's nothing after death doesn't alleviate my fear, it just makes me fear it more. Isn't this irrational and incoherent? It is very difficult to make sense of the fact that you could be sort of very terrified of nothing. Literally nothing, because that's what's coming after death. How does that make any sense? The point is that although almost everyone has rejected Radford's answer, it actually might have something going for it, so don't just reject it out of hand. Second final point. You must keep in mind that you can mix and match the theories we've looked at for different emotions and different contexts. So far, this video has operated on the assumption that the wide variety of responses that we have to fictions can all adequately be captured by just one theory. But this assumption is actually very silly. Why shouldn't we just draw on many of these responses? Maybe the non-rationality theory is right for fear, while the quasi-emotion theory is right for sadness and pity, while the counterpart theory is right for disgust and sexual arousal, etc. We can be pluralists about this. I suppose one problem here is that philosophers like to have simple theories. We like to ask, what's the single basic principle that governs these phenomena? But the simple theories are only really appropriate if the phenomena in question are simple. And emotions aren't simple. Emotions are very complex and messy, and they're not. They're not sort of these simple, easy things. Consider our responses not to fictions but to real life situations. Is there just one way we respond emotionally to real life events? Of course not. So why should there be just one way we respond emotionally to fictions? There's no reason to assume that. In fact, it would be, I think, quite silly to assume that we are going to find just one theory that kind of accounts for our emotional responses to fictions. Anyway, that was the paradox of fiction. I hope you found it interesting. Thank you for watching. That's it. That's as much as we'll be talking about today. And that's the end of this particular little, well, it wasn't a series, only 2 videos. But thanks for watching, and I'll see you whenever. Goodbye.